usually the NIH tries to work with you first to realign your priorities to align with their new initiatives, but they said that they're not doing this at this time. And the basic premise of why they say that is because they don't believe that trans people exist.
Hey y'all, I'm Tommy Tomlinson, and from WFAE in Charlotte, this is SouthBound. Conversations with people from all walks of life about how the South shapes who they are and what they do. This episode of SouthBound is a little different. Sometimes I think of this podcast as like the feature section of a newspaper. Today's story is more like front page news. We've all seen the stories about the massive cuts in the federal government triggered by the Trump administration, and especially Elon Musk and his DOGE agency. Today we're bringing you the story of one of those cuts. Our guest is Annelise Mennicke, the co-leader of a project at UNC Charlotte to find better counseling options for LGBTQ victims of sexual violence. She and her team had won a $450,000 grant from the National Institutes of Health. Annelise, another faculty member, and 6 students had already started the work. Then, on March 20th, they got a letter from the NIH terminating the grant. The letter, among other things, made it clear that the grant was being canceled because the research involved gender identity. Annelise talked to me about the difficulty of getting the federal grant, any federal grant, in the first place, the scientific rigor of the study, how much it hurt to lose the funding, and most of all, why it matters. I hope this episode does a little to flesh out the impact of these cuts, not just on the people losing their jobs and the funding they need for their work, but for the rest of us who will never get a chance to benefit from what they could have done. Here's our conversation. So first of all, let's just kind of start simple. Kind of describe what you do at UNC Charlotte, maybe teaching and kind of your normal areas of research.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of social work, and I primarily teach in the undergraduate sequence, teaching students how to do research to improve their social work practice and use evidence-based practices in their social work. So research is a passion of mine, and I really try to instill with undergraduate students the importance of research and using evidence and data to make informed decisions. And so my research area is broadly in the field of violence prevention. So I try to use a public health model to help us understand the nature of violence, why it's occurring, where it's occurring, to create interventions that are targeted to communities who are most at risk so we can develop effective interventions. And my work kind of spans across multiple forms of violence, from a lot of sexual violence prevention, dating violence prevention. We have some projects on child sex trafficking prevention. And then now, because this is an issue in Charlotte, a lot of work related to gun violence prevention.
And describe a little bit about this particular grant that we're going to talk about in more detail. Like what did y'all set out to do there?
Yeah, so this is a grant that we had been working on for a very long time. I think the first iteration of this grant was submitted in 2018. And the goal was really to help survivors of sexual violence who were in the LGBT community recover from that victimization faster. And one thing that we know from the literature is that the majority of victims of sexual assault, the first person that they talk to is a friend. And oftentimes, friends just aren't trained in how to respond. And so, unfortunately, they can respond in a way that makes that healing trajectory worse. And it can increase PTSD, mental health symptoms, lead to alcohol use, and ultimately even lead to people becoming victimized again. So what we wanted to do in this grant was take an evidence-based program called Supporting Survivors and Self and modify it to be inclusive of the LGBT community so that we could be serving survivors who were most at risk of experiencing violence.
So that Supporters Survivor, that's an existing organization that's already out there helping people who are not LGBTQ. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's an existing program. I think it started at the University of Nebraska, and there's a few research articles demonstrating its effectiveness in improving people's responses to disclosure of sexual violence. So that program was what we call a universal program intended to be delivered to everyone, and so it's kind of generic. Whereas we saw a need to make it specific to some of the needs of the LGBT community. So, providing examples, using inclusive language, talking about some of the ways that LGBT folks use online media or engage with people over text messaging, and making sure that was represented so that their healing could be the forefront of this and help them on their trajectory to improving health.
I think you may have answered this just a little bit just now, but are there issues around sexual violence in the LGBTQ community that are different than elsewhere?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a black box, but what we do know from the data is that LGBT individuals are 2 to 3 times at risk of experiencing sexual violence. So much higher rates. And that is not a monolithic population. So once you dive down even deeper, if we're talking about bisexual women and even bisexual men, those individuals are at even higher risk of being victimized. So we know that differential risk is there. So they're not necessarily higher in number, but the proportion of LGBT people who experience it is higher than cisgender and heterosexual people. And then once they experience victimization, they also have worse outcomes, higher rates of PTSD, higher rates of drinking. And that's because of something that we call minority stress theory. So people internalize all of these negative things, the stigma and shame, and take that upon themselves, internalize it, and that leads to them feeling worse about themselves, leading to more negative behaviors, and then ultimately being victimized again. So, kind of the mechanism of why or the exact specifics of what is occurring, we know less about, but we know there's differential heightened risk and worse consequences.
You said y'all had been trying to get this grant in some form or fashion for several years. Could you kind of explain, most of us have never done this, kind of what that process is like and what you have to do to just apply for a grant and get one in the first place?
Yeah, so this is a grant from the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And the NIH is really kind of the gold standard of rigor for scientific research. So the process is extremely arduous, even to submit an application. So Dr. Jess Moxie and I, the first time that we submitted this grant, we went out and went to Fig Tree and had a fancy dinner to celebrate the fact that we even submitted a grant. Because it's just hundreds and hundreds of meticulously formatted pages with all of these appendices and other documents. So you have to make a really solid case for what you're doing. Once you do that, it goes to a peer review panel. And you're specifically assigned 2 to 3 reviewers who read your entire application and score you on different categories of how significant is the project, how innovative of it is it, what is are the methods sound, and overall, what do we think the impact for the community or for science will be. Once you get those reviews back, the committee comes together and they only talk about the applications that are in the top 50%. So right off the gate, you are not even discussed if you're in that bottom barrel. So once you get discussed, you get what's called a score, and that score can determine whether or not you get funded. That score gets brought to an advisory council, and then ultimately the head of the institutes decides whether the project is within their priorities, how much funding they have, and all these different things. So I think this was our 6th or 7th submission of it. And we finally got a low enough score in the NIH world. Actually, low is better. So we got a low enough score to get funded. And it felt like a real achievement and a hallmark of the work and the efforts that we'd put into it.
You're saying you had submitted that particular study 6 or 7 times. And along the way, had you submitted other studies as well? Like, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is like, what's the usual success rate for something like this?
This was our sixth or seventh iteration of this specific project. We do have other submissions that we've made. So this is my third NIH grant, and I've been working at it this is my 10th year at the university. So these institutes range between as low as like only 15% of the applications get funded to as high as maybe 25 to 30%, but it is a small number of the applications that actually get awarded.
And I guess I should stop and ask here this topic in specific, and maybe your studies of violence in general, is this personal to you in any way? Like what made you decide to work in this area?
I'm a social worker, and so kind of elevating minoritized communities is kind of what my training is and what my values are. And so that's always been a part of my mission. And the reason that I came into the world of violence, there is a little bit of a personal story related to my father was murdered by a gun, and when I was a very small child. And so that kind of brought me into the impacts of interpersonal violence, the long-term impacts on the family. And then specifically came over to the world of interpersonal violence prevention, sexual violence prevention through some work that I did at some crisis centers and victim advocacy program, and really seeing the differential impacts for women and LGBT folks.
When did you find out that y'all had gotten the grant, and what did you do when you found out?
So NIH is a coy little squirrel. Like they don't like to ever tell you that you're getting it until you're 100%, they are 100% certain. So I think we had received a favorable score that was kind of within the margins of something we felt like might get funded back in August of 2023, maybe December, sometime right at the end of 2023. And we didn't actually receive the notice of award, so the official start of the grant, until April 2024. And I think we submitted this version of it in February 2023. So it was kind of a long, drawn out process to finally receive the funds. And so by the time we actually got the notice of award, it felt a little bit anticlimactic. So I don't think we had a fancy dinner at Fig Tree again, but the crew and the people that I work with, we kind of regularly get together and celebrate our collective joys and commiserations. So we might have gone somewhere else and had a drink, but it definitely was something that was like, we finally got this. This is a mark. And for my co-investigator, Jess Moxie, this was her first NIH grant. And so it was really important to her and feels even more of a loss because we had worked so hard to get it. And she is an earlier career scholar than I am. And this is a really important marking stone for promotion and tenure and things like that. And so she's really worried about the career disruptions this could have for her.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a little bit, but I want to kind of get to the process of the research then. Now, have y'all already started working on this? I know you told me at some point that you kind of put together a team, right?
Yeah, so this is a really cool grant called an R15 that is both a research grant and a training grant. And so it's only universities like UNC Charlotte are the only ones that are eligible because they don't have a ton of NIH funding. So the whole purpose of the grant is to help you train undergraduate and graduate students in the pipeline of scientific research so that you can get more NIH funding and federal funded research in the future. And so we had put together a team of 5 undergraduate students and 1 graduate student with the 2 investigators, me and Dr. Moxie. And we had done the first part of the project, which was take the existing program, put it in front of people, LGBT people, and ask them what they thought about it. What needed to stay, what needed to be modified, what was good, could be tweaked, what suggestions they had. So we had completed 7 focus groups that included 29 people in Charlotte from the LGBT community and gotten their feedback. We just actually when the first kind of federal pause notifications came out, we had our last focus group occur. And now we were working on analyzing that data. So coding those focus groups, developing the code book, and truly trying to understand what modifications need to be made. So when the termination notice came on March 20th, we had to immediately stop all work. So our students were in a real bit of limbo, both employment wise, but also like they've been working on this project for a long time. They had to stop everything. And now we're actually not sure where we go next with the project. We have enough funding from the university to carry us through the end of the semester. But after that, we can't continue actually making the changes that people suggested and then testing whether it has its intended goal of improving how people respond.
When we come back, Annelise Mennicke talks about the scale of the cuts to research programs across the country.
The week of March 17th through the 24th, I think, there was just 10, 15, 20, 100. Now I think the number is up to over 300 grants that were terminated specifically because they had LGBT focus during that week, and they're still kind of trickling in.
That and more ahead on Southbound. Before we get back to this episode, I wanted to ask for a little help with something. If you enjoy Southbound, please give us a good rating and write us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider you have that allows such things. The more reviews and better ratings we get, the better chance there is that other listeners can find us. But to be honest, I'd just as soon you tell people about Southbound through good old word of mouth. If you could recommend it to just one person you know, somebody you might think would enjoy interesting conversations about the South, I'd be deeply grateful. If you have any thoughts about the show, guests to recommend, or anything that you think might make Southbound better, you can email me at ttomlinson@wfae.org. Thanks so much for giving us a little bit of your time. And now, back to my conversation with Annelise Mennicke. When did y'all start to worry that this grant might be threatened?
Around right before and around January 20th, we had started thinking about what could happen, how
January 20th being Inauguration Day.
Inauguration Day, yes.
Yeah.
And we kind of had gone through a list of things that we might think might happen. We felt like there were going to be cuts to the National Institutes of Health, but we thought that that was going to look really different. So in kind of my worst case scenario, it was existing calls for grants would be terminated. So you wouldn't be able to apply for new grants. That would be kind of phase one. Phase two would be every year when you have an existing grant, you have to renew it and you have to submit this whole renewal application and demonstrate that you're doing the work that you said you were going to do. So in my mind, they were going to receive those renewals and then say, no, you're not getting your next year of funding. And then I actually didn't really think that we would ever get to the place where current contract in the middle of work grants would get terminated. And that started happening less than a month into this current administration. Or the calls for review of if you have an NIH grant and it has these specific keywords, that was the first level of review. And I knew we were in a little bit of trouble when we had the NIH, you have like a contact person, they're called a program officer. And that program officer is your point of contact. So our program officer called, asked for a call, and she wanted to let us know that we had asked for a supplement to our grant to support one more student, and that's called a diversity supplement. So the student has to meet certain criteria and you can get additional funding. And she called us to let us know that 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 notice of award was not going to be able to be made at this time because of this review, this keyword that review they were going to do. She told us then, and that was in January still, I think at the end of January, she said, I think your grant is safe. Right now, they're only focused on grants that are exclusively studying transgender folks. And since you're not doing that, I think you'll be okay. And then everything kind of went silent for a little while. And I started to get really worried when my colleagues across the country were just reporting my grant got terminated, and it was just person after person after person. The week of March 17th through the 24th, I think, there was just 10, 15, 20, 100. Now I think the number is up to over 300 grants that were terminated specifically because they had LGBT focus during that week, and they're still kind of trickling in.
By the way, how does the actual funding work? Do you get paid like a certain amount up front and then it's more is doled out as you go along? How does that go?
Yeah, so the NIH operates on a reimbursement process. So you are given a certain amount of funds to use for very specific things that were in your budget, but the university then has to invoice, and that invoice is usually like on a 30-day, net 30 period. So when we got the notice of termination, we had to stop all activities, and we have 30 days to bill for previous work that had been done, but couldn't bill for anything beyond March 20th.
And how far along would you say you were, like percentage wise, in what you wanted to do?
So we think about the grant as it having three steps, and we were almost done with the first step. I would put us at probably 30% done with the grant.
Have you ever had a grant canceled before?
No, never. It's pretty unheard of in the federal landscape because you enter into a contract with the federal government. You are awarded it based on extremely rigorous peer review. You are awarded it based on the priorities of the institution at the time that you submit it, and you enter into a contract. And so it's extremely rare to ever have a termination. In the past, the reasons terminations occurred are because of researcher misconduct or major scientific changes that negate the work that you're doing. But usually, and this is actually in our notice of termination, usually the NIH tries to work with you first to realign your priorities to align with their new initiatives. But they said that they're not doing this at this time. And the basic premise of why they say that is because they don't believe that trans people exist.
I want to read. You had sent me a letter from the NIH that I guess was the kind of official notice of cancellation. There's one paragraph that I want to read real quick. This award no longer effectuates agency priorities. Research programs based on gender identity are often unscientific, have little identifiable return on investment, and do nothing to enhance the health of many Americans. Many such studies ignore rather than seriously examine biological realities. It is a policy of NIH not to prioritize these research programs. So that's pretty much the key point they're making, right?
Yeah.
How did you feel when you read that?
It's painful to read, it's painful to hear. And it's just deeply saddening because it's based on, it's not scientific. That information that it's people are showing their cards, they're showing their playbook, that they are saying that we are not being scientific, and they provide no scientific evidence for the claims that they are making. It is an actual fact that trans people exist, and we cannot ignore the needs that they have, and we can't ignore them here in Charlotte. Like, it's just, I can't even begin to comprehend how you can put into policies that just spew so much negativity and hate when these people exist and they have needs, and there are ways that we can help.
By the way, so this letter is signed by Michelle G. Bowles on behalf of Judy Fox, Chief Grants Management Officer. Did you know, or do you know any of either of those people?
No, the funny thing is that those are actually not normally a letter like that would be signed by the head of an institute or an agency. And what I've heard from folks at NIH and other researchers who's had terminations is that the NIH staff are refusing to sign these letters because they don't agree. The actual staff on the ground that have been here decades long, career employees, can't support these things. And so I don't know who Michelle is. And then there's another name in there, the acting director. It's just kind of passing the buck and passing the responsibility. And the actual people who know the science and evidence are no longer in decision-making authority.
I guess you at the faculty level got that letter, and then I assume you had to tell the students.
Yeah, that was about as painful as you reading that paragraph. This has been a really tumultuous time for our students. We have students on our research team who are part of the LGBT community, racial and ethnically diverse. We have students who are part of the North Carolina community and just had experienced impacts from Hurricane Helene. And so it's been a really hard time in our research lab. And because of the work that we do, our number one priority is to care for each other. And it's been really hard to instill in our students that these systems are looking out for them when it feels like they are being attacked at every direction. It was requested very briefly that we pause our activities a few weeks ago when there was a lot of uncertainty with the federal funding pauses. So when that first happened, we had to talk to the students about that. And that was a really difficult meeting. There was frustration, anger, tears, fear. And so we were pretty quickly were able to resume work after that federal funding pause. But we had been in pretty transparent conversation with students about we know a lot of grants that are being terminated. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know the university has been really generous in covering their hourly rate for the rest of the semester. So we've kind of been saying like this might happen, but we've got your back for this amount of time. So when it happened, it was kind of like crickets because they were expecting it, but also feeling really disappointed. I could hear when students did start talking again, a sense of fear. And part of that fear was related to we had a contract with, well, we had told them that they were going to be employed through the summer and even stay on for the duration of the project. And so while the university is able to cover another 6 weeks for them, they are now scrambling to get summer jobs. And that's not an easy thing to do in this economy. So they're freaking out that they're not going to be able to work and then many of them are public health students. So what are they going to do with their careers? And it's just been a really hard time taking care of the people that this grant was meant to support and build up.
I think another portion of the letter basically says, I'm paraphrasing here, there's an appeals process for this, but don't bother. And so I'm wondering if you feel like basically this thing is done or if there's any way to resurrect
I mean, we're scrappy folks, so we're gonna bother.
it.
We're gonna make this as difficult for them as possible to justify. So the university is working with us to officially submit an appeal, and that is after a strong encouragement from the staff that we work with at the NIH. They said they support it, they will work with us, however. So we have no idea what happens when we submit that appeal and probably won't be able to win that appeal, but we also I have heard from, because like I said, there were hundreds of grants that were terminated. So I do think that there's going to be some lawsuits that are filed in the very near future to try to, at minimum, talk about how this is a contract breach and then also talk about how there's animus to the LGBT community. We're going to fight because we believe in these causes. I was talking with another researcher and we just want our grants back and we just want the LGBT community to get the resources that they deserve to make the world a safer place for them.
So you'd said that you had heard, even before this happened, from a lot of your colleagues around the country who've had similar things happen. What are those text threads, conversations like? What are people saying? Are people wanting? Are people worried that the work's not worth doing anymore? Are people looking to get out? What are people saying?
I think people right now are enraged and trying to figure out what are avenues that we can fight this. There's a lot of talk about people turning to foundations to support their research. And so that's going to become an ultra competitive environment to try to get research funding for. So I think that there is still hope as of every time I talk, I have to say the date, like as of March 27th, or whenever this, as of today, we believe that some of these things can be undone by the judicial system and these grants can be restored and this work can continue to happen. We believe that there are the structures in place to do that. Now, university is being attacked on all fronts, and so how long we'll have the ability to work in this is to be seen. But right now, the work isn't going to stop because this is our life, this is our passion, these are the things that we believe in, and there isn't a way for us to pivot. We aren't doing some other type of medical research where you can just kind of switch your specimens or do things like that. Like at our core, we believe in a more just world.
As you move forward, and maybe some of your colleagues are already dealing with this, are you having to like think about, are there keywords I can't use? Are there topics I can't use? I mean, have you gotten any direction from like the university on this or any of that sort of thing?
I don't speak on behalf of the university, but what my understanding is the university is also confined by the Board of Trustees at the state level. And then there's also just some recent legislation introduced that is anti-DEI. There are some limitations in what researchers can do if the work they are doing is about recruiting diverse students or training diverse students. And so we have had some grants where we had to be very intentional in our language to make it clear that those opportunities were available to everybody. But at the end of the day, in the current university system that we operate in, we have academic freedom. And so the university has very clearly stated that as researchers, you can research what you want to do, how you want to do it, and we cannot censor that. And so they've been really good at protecting that within the confines of our research.
So I want to wrap up with one last thing. So let's pretend for a second that I'm on the other side of this issue and that I'm somebody who maybe just doesn't want the government spending as much money as it spends. Or maybe that I'm somebody who has trouble with LGBTQ issues or whatever and certainly doesn't want the government spending money on that. We both know there are a lot of people like that out there and not just in positions of power. So why should I feel like this matters to me?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that LGBT people are part of our community and we all want to have a healthy community. And so if we can keep the most vulnerable in our community safe and healthy, together Charlotte can thrive. We know that they exist and we know, I think that if from an economic argument, it actually costs more not to provide services to people as they spiral into deep mental health conditions or deep substance use. And so if we're able to intervene and provide support, that will be the economic impact of that is quite offsetting. There is a lot of evidence that prevention can work and it is cheaper than intervention after the fact. And so I think from the basic health and safety standpoint, it makes our community safer, healthier, and it's cheaper for us.
From 1975 to 1988, William Proxmire, a Democratic senator from Wisconsin, gave out what he called the Golden Fleece Award, a tongue-in-cheek award meant to spotlight misuse of federal spending. It was a nice idea, but as with almost any nice idea, in the wrong hands, it could be reshaped into something monstrous. This is what's happening now. Elon Musk, with the permission of President Trump, is taking an army of chainsaws to the federal government. They are clear-cutting entire departments, getting rid of thousands of federal employees, and slashing billions of dollars in spending. The problem with deforesting an entire landscape is that you will probably find out down the road that somebody needed some of those trees to survive. Part of the reason Annelise Mennicke and her colleagues lost their federal grant, surely, is that they dared to do research that showed concern for our LGBTQ friends and neighbors, especially those who are trans. But their grant, and so many others, also just happened to be in the way of the bulldozers. You hear talk all the time about how we should treat the government more like a business, but it's not a business. That's the whole point of it. It's not there to make money. It's there to spend money, not just on interstates and fighter planes, but on speculative research that sometimes amounts to nothing and sometimes changes our entire world. A grant of $450,000 is a grain of sand in the bucket of the federal budget. But it could have made a huge difference in the lives of some of our most vulnerable citizens. SouthBound is a production of WFAE in Charlotte. Our editors are Eli Portillo and Jen Lang. Our main theme music comes from Joshua Lee Turner. You can listen to this and other episodes of SouthBound on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the NPR app, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Subscribe for free to get each new episode sent to you when it's ready. You can also find SouthBound on our website. Just go to wfae.org/podcast/southbound. See y'all next time. Thanks for listening.